China in transition, everything's always in transition. So why China in transition? If you ask the Chinese, they'd say we are in transition from a feudal semi-colony to being a modern socialist state. And if you ask a civilian in the West, he would say, or she would say, China's in transition from a Stalinist type economic model to a capitalist type economic model. And I want to suggest something slightly broader than either of those models, to suggest, not to tell you where China's going, because I know that the military question is, China is rising, is she going to be an enemy? Have we got to prepare for this new Japan, new Germany, whatever? But I want to take a broader view and to make what I hope will be some optimistic suggestions, or not optimistic by some people's reckoning. Let's go back to the Chinese view of their transition. They started their transition with the beginnings of the Opium War in 1839, when the British tried to drag China into the global economy, knew that they liked opium, started forcing opium in through the Chinese ports, and when the Chinese objected, they fought the first Opium War, 39-42, which led to Hong Kong becoming a British colony, supposedly forever, but forever comes rarely. Now, the next 100 years or so, China has retailed the idea of being a nation of victims. And indeed, they were victimized by the Western imperialist powers during the 19th century. There was a succession of wars, succession of unequal treaties. I think it's appropriate to call them unequal treaties that were imposed upon them. But the interesting thing is that the Chinese never really thought that this was a serious challenge. They have this magnificent culture, this centuries, millennia indeed, of history, poetry, of painting, of ceramics, and most importantly, a political system which, give or take some modifications and give or take some centuries of disunity, nevertheless was the same in the 19th century in essence as it had been when it was first created, the first empire, in the 3rd century BC. That's an incredible longevity of any political system. And the Chinese couldn't believe that what these strange Westerners were doing could threaten that system. And they developed the tagline, Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use. In other words, we'll try and buy a couple of gunships and a few guns, and we'll see if we can't hold them off that way. But we've really got to stick with our Confucian imperial state system. And so they tried to get their act together, and what finally convinced them that there had to be real changes, very interestingly, was the fact that the Japanese, who had always been seen by them as their pupils, their younger brothers if they were being polite, pirate monkeys if they were being impolite, suddenly the Japanese, having seen what was happening to China, decided this was not going to happen to them and started to modernize and transform themselves into a modern nation state, so powerful that in 1894-95 in war they defeated the Chinese Empire and extracted Taiwan from them, something which the Chinese to this day, of course, have not got back. Now, what was it that the Chinese were so proud of? What was the system that they thought was so powerful and shouldn't be changed? And I like to represent it in the form of what I call an iron triangle. And at the head was the emperor, supported by a bureaucracy, and a bureaucracy whose right to rule was based upon a state ideology which was adhered to by all. The state ideology was, of course, Confucianism. I should just put ideology. And at the bottom of the triangle was the perennial support of the civil power, the military. And the people of China were within that iron triangle. Now, without modern means of communication and organization, it was not as iron as it might be today, and there was a lot of flexibility in the system. But basically, this was a totalitarian system, because not only was it did you have to obey the emperor and his bureaucrats, but also Confucianism provided a social theory as well. Confucius was perhaps the first person who emphasized the importance of family values for state stability. And these family values were inculcated into Chinese. Obviously, Chinese peasants only dimly comprehended them, but filial piety, the relationship between husband and wife, between father and son, these things did penetrate. And the idea was if the family stayed together, the state was powerful. And the emperor was supposed to provide an example to the fathers of families, and if he did, then the whole thing would stay together. Now, as I said earlier, the state collapsed from time to time. New dynasties took over. There were periods of disunity. But this system persisted because it was such a strong system that it was something which no emperor of a new dynasty, no bureaucrat wanted to give up. And the power of the bureaucrats was that they were educated in the ideology. Because they knew the ideology, they had the right to rule. Okay, this was the system which, at the end of the 19th century, after the defeat by the Japanese, with great reluctance, the Chinese began to think about giving up. There was a debate in 1898 between the reformers and the conservatives. And the conservatives said, we cannot give up the system of our ancestors. And the reformers said, what use is the system of our ancestors if we can't defend the territory of our ancestors? And so there was a brief spurt of reform in 1898. And the only thing that lasted out of that reform is Peking University, which is still there today in Beijing. But the Empress Dowager, who cracked down on that reform period, was forced to give way a few years later when the combined troops of the Western powers, plus now the Japanese, who in effect were honorary Westerners by now, marched on the Chinese capital in order to relieve a siege of the Western missions in Beijing. And after that, even the Empress Dowager, tough Manchu lady though she was, had to realize that reform was going to have to be accepted. And the major reform was that no longer was it possible to think in terms of Confucianism being the answer. And in 1905, the Confucian exam system, which was the way that these bureaucrats proved that they had the knowledge to become bureaucrats, the Confucian exam system was abolished. So what you had as a result of this decision was you had no ideology. Gone. And this meant that the bureaucrats, while they were still there, someone had to keep running the country, they were emasculated because they no longer had the legitimation of the knowledge which they'd acquired in order to become bureaucrats. And in this situation, as you can see, it's possible for all sorts of new ideas to start coming in because the ideology is not there and the central government is not perpetuating the ideology, so new ideas can come in into China. And the idea which the leading revolutionary of the time, Sun Yat-sen, adopted was democracy, because he felt that was the reason why the Western powers had been able to send their troops and their ships across the oceans to attack China, was because they had mandates from the people. But Sun Yat-sen, though he did have a revolutionary movement, he was not really a very successful revolutionary. He was not always in the right place at the right time. When the revolution of 1911 took place, which was when the imperial system, after 2,000 years, finally collapsed, he was in Denver, Colorado, raising money. But nevertheless, the system collapsed partly as a result of his efforts. And so there was an attempt made to install a democratic system, an attempt which quickly disappeared as warlords asserted their control over various parts of China. Now, the important thing about having no emperor any longer, just whichever warlord was in charge of the capital was accepted by the Western powers as the leader of China, having no Confucian bureaucrats, you have the military in effect taking over as a result. That's the warlord period. But still the ideas come in. And people are looking everywhere for new ideas. How do we save China? We've abandoned Confucianism. It worked for 2,000 years. We've abandoned it. How do we save China? And they explored all sorts of angles. Anarchism, democracy, liberalism, whatever. The one thing they did not explore was Marxism. They didn't explore it because Marx had said revolution will come in developed countries. So he had expected it to happen in Germany or in Britain, maybe one day in America, but not where it actually happened, which of course was in Russia, because Russia was a backward, only just beginning to industrialize agrarian empire. So it was not an appropriate place. But that's where the revolution took place in 1917, and suddenly, sort of light bulb. Young people in China, and Sun Yat-sen himself said, my God, here these intellectuals, the Bolsheviks, have taken over power from this vast empire. We're a bunch of intellectuals. Why don't we do something similar? Why don't we copy them? And Sun Yat-sen sought military and political advice from the Russians, didn't become a communist. But some young people, Mao among them, joined the new Communist Party. The idea being that if we're going to emulate the Russians, if we're going to start being a powerful country, then we need to follow the way in which they pioneered and transform China as they are beginning to transform Russia. And one thing that encouraged them greatly was that the Russians, the Soviets, as they had now become, were very anti-imperialist. And they promised, and to this day they have not kept that promise, they promised that all the territories which the Tsars had taken from imperial China would be returned. As I say, never done. But nevertheless, it was a promise which was in stark contrast to what the Western powers had done. And so that encouraged the young idealistic Chinese, the patriotic Chinese who wished to transform China, to join the Communist Party. Now, I don't have the time this afternoon to go through the history of the years from the formation of the Communist Party in 1921 to its conquest of power in 1949. Suffice it to say, as you probably know, there was a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. It stopped during the anti-Japanese war, and then, despite American mediation, it resumed after World War II, and the communists won. And the communists set up a state which was, in effect, Back to the Future. They were setting up a state which was based upon the Soviet example. They had abandoned the Confucian essence, but they had found a new essence, Marxism, Leninism. This would be the ideology which would guide the new China. And what they created, in effect, was another and far more powerful iron triangle, with Mao at the top, the Chinese Communist Party, the bureaucrats, and their right to rule, and Mao's right to rule, based upon Marxism, Leninism, and as the years went by, Mao Zedong thought. And of course, the People's Liberation Army as the final force to defend the civil power, as we saw in June '89. And inside, again, the people of China. People of China, again, no longer being taught really family values, because what young people in China were now being taught was that all loyalty should go to the party and to the chairman. So it wasn't so much family values, but there were certainly social values, commitment to the party state. And so a much stronger totalitarian system was created in 1949 and was enforced by a series of bloody campaigns during the early 50s. We don't know exactly how many people died during that time. Mao, in a speech, once said 800,000, but some Chinese friends of mine think that that was just a partial accounting, and the figure was much greater. But by 1956, that's 7 years after they'd conquered power, they had collectivized agriculture, something which took the Soviets twice as long and ruined Soviet agriculture forever, never really recovered. They had collectivized agriculture without that kind of damage. They had nationalized the big state industries, big industries, and they had collectivized everything else: commerce, small industry, handicrafts, so on. So they had achieved, the Chinese Communist Party had achieved in a few years, to the amazement of the Russians, something which had taken the Soviets much longer and had been a much more disastrous and devastating path internally. I know that Professor Yu is very keen on Winston Churchill. He uses Churchill in one of his lectures, I think. During the war, Churchill asked Stalin about collectivization, and Stalin said, terrible time, terrible time. 10 million, I think he said, were affected, killed by it, at his orders, usually. So the Chinese set up this very powerful state. And had they gone on in the Soviet mode with 5-year plans, the normal way that the Russians used to run their economy, they would have been East Germany when they grew up. What do I mean by that? I mean that the very few communist regimes have really made a success of the Soviet-style system that prevailed under Stalin and after. And the East Germans probably were about the best who made it work, and the Chinese would have made it work, insofar as it would have been possible to make that kind of system really efficient and produce wealth. But the Chairman Mao, as he was known, Chairman Mao decided that this was too slow and too Soviet. I mean, where was the Chinese essence? The Chinese essence was now a foreign essence. It was Marxism-Leninism. And he wanted, in my view, a new essence, a more Chinese essence. The sense of Chinese exceptionalism had not deserted Chinese leaders, especially someone like Mao, who grew up while the empire still existed and was imbued with some of the classical education. And a second reason why it wasn't good enough for him was because it was too slow. The third reason why it wasn't good enough for him was because it made him irrelevant. Mao was a revolutionary. If you have a 5-year plan, you need nuts and bolts people. And he had nuts and bolts people around him: Zhou Enlai, the prime minister, Liu Shaoqi, the head of state. But that meant he was irrelevant. So he opted for a faster method of development, a bootstrap method of development, whereby they used mass labor in order to achieve things which they couldn't achieve with capital because they had no capital. And that was, as some of you may have heard of, an economic experiment called the Great Leap Forward, which was one of the biggest disasters in human history because it led to almost certainly the biggest man-made famine in human history. We don't know how many people died. I think the Chinese now admit to something like 20 million. The Western demographers say something like 30 million. And a senior Chinese official, now in exile in this country, who was told to go around the provinces and check all the records that he could find, once told me he thought it was about 43 million people. These figures are so big that the mind boggles. One can't grasp what 43 million people dead who shouldn't be dead is. But that was the result of the Great Leap Forward because he tried to do two things at the same time. One, to have an economic campaign, but at the same time to have a ideological campaign, to make people even more egalitarian and more collectivist than they already were in the system they'd set up in the 50s. It failed. They had to recover from the famine. But Mao did not give up. Mao still felt that there was an important role for China. The Soviet Union, he felt, was becoming what he called revisionist, revising Leninism, too soft on America. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, could say, but we don't want a nuclear war. And of course, No one wanted it, but Mao thought that was just expedience, and they should confront the Americans. They were potentially as powerful as the Americans. They should confront the Americans. And he accused the Russians of revising Marxist-Leninist doctrine. And in effect, he started to increase the importance of his own thinking, his own revolutionary thinking, in the direction of Chinese policy. And what he finally decided to do was to launch something which he called the Cultural Revolution. Lasted, in Mao's mind, it only lasted 3 years, but the people who survived the Cultural Revolution said it lasted from 1966 till Mao's death in 1976. And in those 10 years, what he aimed to do was to wipe out the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't mean physically wipe out, I mean dismiss from office. Some of them died in prison and so on, but they were not executed at his orders. To remove from office the top level of the Chinese leadership in order to replace them with a new generation of revolutionary successors. How were they going to be revolutionary? These people your age. Imagine, if you were told today, as Mao told the young people of China in 1966, bombard the headquarters, to rebel is justified, what would you do? Well, you'd probably go out and try and take over some ship somewhere. And, you know, the ship's crew would probably kick the hell out of you. So it wasn't an easy thing. But what he wanted to do was to throw the kids of China into a battle with these hardened revolutionaries who'd been fighting, some of them for 20, 30 years, and who were in positions of power in various parts of the country. And he helped them a bit by removing the central leadership first by himself, and then said, okay, go do it. And the result was 2 or 3 years of total chaos, with the Red Guards, as they were called. You may all remember the name or know the name. The Red Guards, as they call themselves, going up and down the country, overturning provincial leaderships, county leaderships, city leaderships, and the party almost paralyzed because they knew that Mao was behind them. Mao's position was so powerful, and his personality was so threatening that none of his colleagues, these are men of enormous personal ability, people who'd fought with Mao for 20, 30 years in the revolution. These are people of enormous substance. None of them stood up against them. And more importantly, they did not get together and say, this is madness, we must stop him. He's finally gone off the rail. And so, for 3 years, the Red Guards, until Mao realized that the military might step in and end it if he didn't do something, the Red Guards ran rampage, and finally Mao sent them off to the countryside and told them to stop their activities. They'd expected to inherit the earth as the successors, and they ended up tilling it. And the Cultural Revolution, however, persisted because of the struggles for power within the groups who had formed the coalition which Mao had put together to run the Cultural Revolution. Finally, at the end of all this, the Cultural Revolution ends in 1976 with Mao's death, and shortly thereafter the arrest of the leading members of his Cultural Revolution group, who include his own wife. They're arrested and later put on trial and given prison sentences. And Deng Xiaoping, had been the General Secretary of China, the Chinese Communist Party before the Cultural Revolution, had been very close to Mao, actually, in the years of the revolution, had survived the Cultural Revolution, and came back and were able to take over power. Not as the chairman, he thought that was a ridiculous thing, he didn't want to start that again, but as the person behind the people who were put in the front ranks of the leadership. And Deng Xiaoping did an amazing thing. Let me first suggest to you what happened to the Iron Triangle as a result of the Cultural Revolution. The Communist Party, for much of the Cultural Revolution, early years, did not function. And as a result of that, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, the PLA had taken over most of the civilian leadership of the provinces. And there were PLA leaders also in the central government. Marxism and Mao Zedong thought had been totally raised in status, and everyone recited his sayings. There was a little red book of quotations which had been put together for the military, and people would wave the little red book and say, "Long live Chairman Mao." But by the end of the Cultural Revolution, you've got a very, very weak party. Almost for a few years it didn't function. And so Deng Xiaoping has to try and put this together again. But he can't really put the party together again, because if you've had party officials of great rank, the great and the good, great and the bad, whatever, who have been paraded through the streets of the Chinese cities, who've been held up to obloquy in the stadiums of Chinese cities, who've had to stand with their head down, a placard denouncing themselves around their neck, and being beaten into the bargain. If that happens to vast numbers of leaders, you begin to think that the organization itself may not be quite so great. I mean, if 3/4 of the members of Congress were indicted for corruption, you might think that was bad, but you might also think there might be something wrong with the US Congress. So in the same way, the party never recovered the legitimation that it had prior to the Cultural Revolution. What's more, there was no longer someone up here who was big. Deng Xiaoping deliberately did not put himself at the top. Everyone knew that he was a leader, but no longer was there this person you had to obey, like you had to obey Mao. But the really damaging thing which Deng Xiaoping did was to say that practice is the sole evidence of truth. What works will do. In other words, ideology, which he didn't abandon, but which was effectively abandoned, no longer counted for anything. And that, of course, again, as the reform program started in the early 80s, the reform and opening up to the outside world, as always, when the Chinese empire was disunited, new ideas come in. And those new ideas accumulate, and they are used as they were in China in the late 80s, and you had the events of Tiananmen, when there was demands for democracy by the student movement, and there was the elevation by art students of a papier-mâché model of the goddess of democracy, who had a strange resemblance to the Statue of Liberty. So in other words, what has happened in China as a result of this reform and opening up is this influx of new ideas. We know why Deng did it. We know why he took this risk. He knew it was a risk. He took this risk because when he came back to power in 79-80, as he looked out over East Asia, there were countries that had been devastated by war, like South Korea. There was a country which was the home of the defeated nationalists, Taiwan. There were the two sleepy entrepôts of Hong Kong and Singapore. And there was Japan, which had been nuked and then had been under American occupation. All these countries had thrown off this sort of background and had become miracle economies. And there was China, which in 49 had all the hallmarks of being the leader, again, of East Asia. There was China having torn itself apart. And so Deng Xiaoping decided that whatever worked, China had to do. That there was no point in hewing to doctrine any longer if it didn't work. And the only thing that he said has to stay is the party. Now the party today, as I've suggested, because of what happened in the Cultural Revolution, didn't have the legitimacy of before. And what's more, it is now riven with corruption, and so it has even less respectability than before. And you can tell by the tens of thousands of demonstrations that take place every year that this is no longer an iron triangle. No one has respect for authority when authority means that they are impinging on your house, they are polluting your rivers, or they are giving bad blood transfusions to your kids. So what you have in China today is a very fragile political system. It doesn't look fragile. If you were in in Beijing during the Olympics, or even you listen to some of the TV coverage, you know that this is a serious country which can organize major events with great aplomb. But nevertheless, the Chinese themselves say, the Chinese leadership themselves say, corruption could be our end, could undermine us. And they know that they are looking at all sorts of problems which could suddenly confront them. No one knew that the students were going to demonstrate in Beijing and 100 other cities, incidentally, with the people of those cities cheering them on in '89. That was a surprise. When the Falun Gong suddenly appeared, 10,000 of them, on the steps of the main government center in Beijing in 1999, even the public security didn't know they were coming. And then there was a SARS epidemic, which took them by surprise. And they know that they are on fragile territory because of the fact that the party's not respected. There's no leader who commands the kind of respect that Mao could during the Cultural Revolution and before. And there's no Deng Xiaoping with a sure hand on the tiller to try and guide them. And Deng Xiaoping has really done great things for China. But the one thing he didn't do was to introduce any kind of pluralist system. That's what he resisted when he suppressed the student democracy movement in 1989. And what I said at the beginning was that China's in a state of transition, but perhaps more optimistic transition than people think. It's not because I think China doesn't have the capacity to build the fleets and train the armies and air forces which could challenge the United States eventually. It's because I think that the fragility of the Chinese system is such that a collapse of it is inevitable at some point. Whether it's next year, 10 years, or whatever, I don't know. And one of my former students said that I was a advocate of what he called the Big Bang theory, and I suppose I am. If you look back at the Chinese history, which I very briefly recounted to you, it has been enormous traumatic events that have caused China to lurch forward in a different direction. The traumatic event of the defeat by Japan led to the collapse of the 2,000-year-old imperial system. The trauma of the Cultural Revolution led to this transformation of China from a normal Soviet-style communist state into the capitalist booming economy that we see today. And my own feeling is that, unlike many of my colleagues, not I think Professor Yu, unlike many of my colleagues, I do not believe there will be a gradual leavening of the system and gradually they will become a democratic system. I believe that a democratic system is inevitable, but no Chinese leader of the Chinese Communist Party, 70 million members strong, all in it for career purposes. It's a Rotary Club these days, not an ideological campaign. No general secretary of that organization is going to come in one day and say, hey, boys, I got an idea. Democracy, that's what we need. It's not going to happen. He'd be out the next day. Sorry, next minute. So my own feeling is that there will be a set of events that will take place which will result in this system being undermined. And what succeeds it will depend on how it is undermined. But that there will be a transformation, a final end of this transition from imperial system that existed in 1839 before the West really started hammering on the doors to a vibrant economic system with a more pluralistic political system. Of that transition, I have no doubt. That's my optimism for today. Thank you.
Okay, we have 20 minutes for question.
This is a delightful talk, and I think really explained a lot of history. Do you see this as the end of any kind of triangle, however defined? And if not, then is there something else? Or is this the end of the triangle that you've so eloquently put forward?
Let me just say that the triangle is actually something which can apply to all political systems. you have a president in the United States. You have a government machine, which may be one party or the other may be on top at any one time, but the ideology is one which all parties accept, which for sake of shortness I will call the American dream, the American ideals, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course there's the National Guard, the Army, which is the ultimate defense of the civil power. But the difference between this and China is that society is a circle around the system. The people are in charge. This may not seem to be the case if you're stopped by a traffic cop, but he's your servant. He's not your master. And that's the difference. So in some form there will be a triangle, because all political systems need a leader, they need a bureaucracy, they need some kind of a dream, national identity, and they will need a military.
The Chinese circle would grow.
The Chinese what?
The Chinese circle that was circumscribed
should grow out, yes. And already, you know, it's peeking out all over the place.
Right.
Yeah.
Will this Chinese system that emerges, will it be conducive to the United States, or do you think it could be, I guess, possibly a revisionist power?
Well, I think that the great thing about a plural system and more democratic system is you can't tell where it's going, because it's the people who are going to decide, not necessarily the leaders. And what is frightening about China today is that there's a great blogosphere. People are all over the internet, and you hear some extreme views. And the Chinese government have indicated, Chinese leaders have indicated, that they look at those extreme views and they trim their own decisions based on those extreme views, even though they're supposedly ruling the country through the Communist Party. So if you take the issue of Taiwan, say, would a democratic China be any different in its views on Taiwan? I suspect not. I think if you put it to a referendum of the people, they'd probably say, yes, we want Taiwan back. It's Chinese. Whatever the people on Taiwan might say at that time. So I think that you know, France has been a democracy for many decades, but France and America have been at loggerheads more often than they've not. President Sarkozy, the present leader, says he's an American. It's a refreshing thing for an American president to hear from a French president. And we'll see how long it lasts. But the fact that a country is a democracy does not mean that there are not going to be problems. And the point about China is that it is going to be a big democracy and a powerful democracy, economically powerful, militarily powerful, and it will begin, as it already has begun at this G20 just concluded, it'll begin to throw its weight around. And sometimes it will be on the American side, sometimes it won't be, as it is at the moment. I mean, the Chinese have got nowhere to go at the moment because they've got so much money invested in American treasury bonds that they can't afford to let the American economy go down. And they also know that the biggest market in the world to sell their goods to is the United States. It's the most open market. So there are plenty of things that could make even a communist China and America work together, as they do in many ways at the moment. Human rights and the oppression of minorities are the big stumbling blocks, of course. But American administrations and Chinese administrations can work together. And one would hope that if China were a more plural society, it would have a different kind of leader and they would work together. The good news is, I think the democratic peace still holds as a theory, doesn't it? Democracies don't fight each other. You know, Britain and America fought in 1812, but I think the American explanation of that is Britain wasn't a full democracy then. Well, America wasn't either, but yeah.
So with this perspective in mind, would you suggest that foreign policy should be shifted from where it is now towards China? And if so, how would you, if President Obama were in this room, how would you advise him to change our approach to China?
Well, what I suggested to, when the Clinton administration was there, what I suggested was that the United States is held in high regard elsewhere by countries which do not copy China, United States in making ideals part of foreign policy. You know, it's not realpolitik. And the strength an admirable strength of the Americans is that while realpolitik can never be discarded, that ideals do play a role in American foreign policy. And my suggestion to the Clinton administration was engagement, yes, endorsement, no. In other words, yes, we do have to engage with you, China. You're a big country, you're a powerful country, and we want you to be part of the world scene and part of the global comradeship. But we're not going to endorse the kind of things you do to Tibetans, to dissidents, and so on. And I think one of the interesting things is that the Chinese want respect more than anything else. They want respect from outside leaders and countries. And the country they want it most from, obviously, is the United States because it's the most powerful. And I think they realize that until they do something in these realms of ideals in American foreign policy, they will not get total respect. The administration will work with them. The Congress will have people who will condemn them. Nancy Pelosi, the present Speaker of the House, of course, has been one of the most critical voices on Chinese treatment of dissidents and others. So I think that the only, and I hope that President Obama's decision to try and get re-entry into the UN human rights body, which the Americans had withdrawn from, is a sign that he is going to, that America will fight the case for pinning blame, because that body is, at the moment, is useless. It just, everyone says everyone else is okay. So I think that the United States will continue to be a beacon of hope to dissidents, as it was for Russian dissidents in the old days, if they continue to emphasize these ideals. And I think that it's quite possible for the United States government to do both, to engage but not to endorse. Yeah.
To what extent is Chinese nationalism on the rise these days or not? And to what extent would that contribute to the endurance or not of the regime in China?
Well, Chinese nationalism is a two-edged weapon, as Chinese governments have known in the modern era. Because when the Chinese delegates to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 were forced to concede former German holdings in China would go to Japan, it was not the Japanese who were attacked, it was the Chinese delegates who were attacked. In other words, nationalism is a very two-edged weapon. The blogosphere is very vocal, very nationalistic in some parts of it. And if there is a sense, for instance, the bombing of the Belgrade embassy by the United States, the Japanese history books, or the obvious controversies that arise, if there is a sense that the Chinese government is not responding fervently enough to this challenge, then it's the Chinese government that will suffer, because the Chinese bloggers can't go to Japan, they can't go to the United States and attack. So they will attack the Chinese government as being falling down in its duty. So I think that Chinese nationalism is certainly there. It's been encouraged. It is encouraged from time to time by the Chinese government. But they try to hold it in check because they don't know which way it'll go and whether or not they will be held responsible for being what we would call responsible, but the nationalists would call weak-kneed in the face of foreign provocation. Yes?
When it comes to Chinese citizens' dissatisfaction with their government, I've read in a few sources that it tends to be at the local level. They'll be dissatisfied with the local government, while they still hold Hu Jintao and the CCP in a much higher regard, kind of reverse of maybe what we see here in the United States.
Absolutely the reverse.
Yeah, so if there was an uprising or an undermining, if you say, would it happen at the local level? How would Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabao, whoever's in power at the time, if this were to happen, how would they handle that situation, or what would be exploited?
Well, that's why one doesn't want to get into either timing or actually modus operandi, because it's so difficult to tell. After the June 4th events in 1989, my theory was that the next place that there could be an eruption was in the northeast, where thousands of workers were thrown on the scrap heap. But there wasn't. Instead, it turned out to be the Falun Gong, of whom I had never heard. before they suddenly erupted on the scene. So it's very difficult to, so you're absolutely right in your description of what opinion polling, which I don't trust generally, but I certainly trust even less in China, but what opinion polling does tell us, apparently, is that the local officials, because they're the people who are corrupt and they can be seen, they're the people who are expropriating and polluting and so on, are the ones who are disliked, and somehow the Tsar is good, but he is far away, still prevails in ideology. But the real thing that the Chinese have to prevent is something local becoming national. And that's why the Falun Gong was such a threat, because this was a national organization. It used all sorts of modern means of communication and to get their followers all together, 10,000 of them, in central Beijing without people knowing they were coming. And what you can say about the Chinese government is that they make very strong efforts that if there's any organization, a Democratic Party a few years ago, is set up, which has any signs of trying to be nationwide, then they'll crush it as quickly as they can. So what I think is likely at the present configuration of forces would be that something spilled over from one province to another province, something of nationwide importance. For instance, if the deaths in the Sichuan earthquake, Professor Yu's home province, if those deaths had not taken place, but had taken place with kids as a result of tainted milk, which fortunately for the Chinese government only killed about 6 children, if that had taken place nationwide, that would have been a massive source of disaffection. That's the kind of thing that might happen. Whereas in the case of Sichuan, where the very powerful feelings were aroused by the fact that the Carter's children went to good schools which didn't collapse, and the poor kids went to schools that did, but they contained it in the province. As long as you can do that. The interesting thing I think about Sichuan earthquake actually is the enormous idealism it awoke among the Chinese people. People from all over the country flocked there to try and help, even if they were told not to. Yes?
What impact has capitalism had in China in the last 10 years, and where do you see it going in the next 10?
What was the first part? What is capitalism?
Yeah, what impact has capitalism had on China in the last 10, and where do you see it going in the next 10?
Well, the impact of capitalism in the last 10 years has been to transform hundreds of millions of people on the Chinese coast, mainly, from being poor to being middle class, being relatively rich. And this is a fantastic achievement. The result, however, you now have people with hundreds of millions of dollars to their name who are listed in Forbes, who are Chinese. But the result has been, and the Chinese regime is very worried about this, is the enormous disparity of wealth. And this is seen visibly, and there are cases where someone in a Mercedes knocks over a poor peasant. And there's immediately an enormous uprising as a result. But the most important effect of capitalism has been to transform the lives of many hundreds of millions of Chinese. I think that the lucky thing for China was that, unlike in the case of the Soviet Union, there was a very strong capitalist spirit, entrepreneurial spirit, at all levels of society, despite the bureaucratic imperial system, and that communism of the Maoist Soviet variety only lasted for about 30 years, whereas the Soviet Union was much longer, and the entrepreneurial background was much weaker. So what has happened has been, as you've seen, is that all over China, people are trying to make an honest yuan. Officials are trying to make a dishonest yuan. And I think over the next 10 years, hopefully, if Hu Jintao's current policy, the harmonious society, which is supposed to mean we've got to shift more wealth to the West, to Professor Yu's home province and others, that will mean that other people will get rich too. That's what they're going to try and do. That means they're going to have to tax the eastern provinces more, take more out of them, and that may cause political problems. But that's the intention, what they want to do. And hopefully it'll succeed. More Chinese will get better off. You had a question, yes?
Going back to the Cultural Revolution
Yeah.
for a second, what were Mao and his allies trying to do in their measures against culture, not just traditional Chinese culture, but it seems like every kind of culture?
Well, artists and writers are the engineers of the soul, Lenin told us. And Mao believed that. And he reined in leftist artists as early as the 40s, long before he came to power, and told them art serves politics. And what they were trying to do during the Cultural Revolution was to sweep away all the traditional forms of Peking opera and Suzhou opera and so on, and to have a system of ballets and operas, and they hadn't got very far by the time the Cultural Revolution was over, which would inspire people with revolutionary ideals. So that you have these slightly absurd operas where the hero has always got red cheeks, very handsome, and looks like this. It's not like me. And the women are equally heroic and fighting, whether it's the Japanese or the nationalists or whoever. But they did apparently, because they were about people today and not about kings and emperors of centuries past, which were in the beloved old operas, nevertheless, there seems to have been some kind of sympathy for these operas because they're about sort of real people writ large, heroic figures perhaps, but still recognized to be real people. But Professor Yu is better able to answer that because he grew up with these kind of things. Did you see some model operas during the Cultural Revolution?
The modern operas actually at the time for generations of young kids were easily understandable, and it's a much better version of entertainment. That's because the old operas were a little bit too prosaic and formulated, and a little weird, because always the man playing women's role, singing in a pitched voice. On the other hand, if you have only 8 operas, that's what the number was, running day in and day out, month after month, year after year, you get bored very quickly. So that's what this challenge.
But the idea, as I said at the beginning, was to try and revolutionize young people through themed revolutionary operas. Yes?
I have a question going back to the triangle and
Yeah.
emphasize ideology as this side. I was wondering what you think about, you know how at the Olympics the government is trying to bring back that idea of harmonious society and Confucian ideals. I was just wondering, like they obviously realize that that lack of ideology is a problem.
Oh, yes, they do.
They're going to be effective in trying to bring back those Confucian ideas. And
I think I have to modify that. Harmonious society sounds Confucian. You're absolutely right, but supposedly it isn't Confucian. I mean, probably Confucian values in the sort of local sense, in terms of filial piety, probably have never been driven out of China. They're still there. So in that sense, Confucianism has not disappeared, despite the efforts first of the intellectuals, leftist intellectuals in the 20s, and then of Mao and his colleagues in the 50s and 60s. But I don't think they can't go back to Confucianism. I mean, that really would be going back to the back. I think that what they're desperately searching for is some kind of glue. That's what Confucianism, that's what Marx and Lenin was. It was a glue that held the whole thing together. And they don't know what it is.
yeah, something like uniquely Chinese. I was in China last fall.
Yeah.
I mean, that was kind of one of the discussions that we had. Like, what can they find?
With your Chinese friends.
Yeah, some teachers. So what is uniquely Chinese?
And what did they say was uniquely Chinese?
Well, there is some talk about bringing back Confucian ideas. There's a couple professors that are trying to apply Confucianism to the modern times. But, I mean, other than that, like, they really are just...
Well, my friend and colleague Du Wei-ming, who teaches Confucianism at Harvard, he was a major figure in China in the 80s when actually China was more open intellectually than it is today, in trying to modernize Confucianism and get Chinese intellectuals to accept it. But, you know, the regime cannot go that far back. I mean, that really is a confession of total defeat. Maybe it'll come back. I'm not saying Confucianism won't come back, but it won't come back under this regime, not formally anyway.
We have time for one more question.
Exhausted. Yes?
So I was just going to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on the Falun Gong and what actual threat they pose to this tradition.
Well, the Falun Gong, the nature of the threat is very simple. The Falun Gong is nationwide and is native Chinese. This is not Christianity. Christianity actually in China, both Catholic and Protestant, has now ballooned in a way that the missionaries of the 19th century would never have dreamt they would see ever in China. But that's not a danger. Those can be kept under observation, including the so-called household churches where people worship privately. But the point about the Falun Gong is that it's nationwide, it's not controlled from outside like Catholicism, and it is very traditional. The exercises which were part of the Falun Gong system were very traditional. And these are the kind of organizations which in past dynasties, including in the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty to rule China, actually brought about rebellion. And so they were worried that it was going to be the basis for a nationwide rebellion sometime in the future. What happened was very simple. There was a professor in Tianjin who said, this is a cult, this should be banned, this Falun Gong business, because the leader, Mr. Li, who is I think now in exile in this country, there were all sorts of fantastical ideas about what his powers were. And this professor in Tianjin said, you know, we should stop this nonsense. And this being an uppity society now, as I've tried to describe, the Falun Gong protested to the Tianjin city administration, said, deal with this guy. And they got no satisfaction, so that's when they decided they would appeal to the central government. Turned up. So Jiang Zemin, who was general secretary at the time and president, was really quite scared of the Falun Gong. And he determined to suppress it. I mean, we all think that Tiananmen was sort of the last big suppression in China, apart from, say, Tibet. But in fact, the suppression of the Falun Gong was much worse, much, much worse across the country. And I think it's because it was native and nationwide.